welcome everyone to today's conversation. So often as a journalist, my job is to write about problems after they've already happened, when companies and institutions and politicians, no longer have the opportunity to address them head on. And so that's why I'm excited to have a forward-looking conversation about election misinformation before the 2022 midterm elections. A recent poll found that just 62% of Americans say they will trust the results of the next presidential election, even if the candidate they support loses, and that included only 1/3 of Republicans. So I think this is a topic that's critical to our democracy and to future elections. And I'm excited to kind of dig into some of the implications and challenges of misinformation. Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for bringing together what is a rock star panel of guests. I know I've talked to some of them myself, and I think you'll be excited to hear what they have to say about this topic. So we have Katie Harbeth. She is a Tech and Democracy Fellow with the Bipartisan Policy Center. We have Maurice Turner. He is a Cybersecurity Fellow with the Alliance for Security Democracy. We have Murphy Herbert. She is the Communications Director for Arizona's Secretary of State. Just as a reminder to kind of give us some rules for the road here, people who are watching this are free to submit questions for our guests. You can put them in the chat on our YouTube channel or Facebook. You can also tweet those questions using the hashtag BPCLive. So once again, that's BPCLive. So I definitely encourage you to do this. These are real experts, and I'm sure they'll have some interesting answers to some of your questions. So let's just start off kind of talking about what happened during, what's happened in the last year since the last election. I think a lot has happened. We had January 6th. We had waves of investigations into voter fraud. We had definitely an active online conversation about the truthfulness of last election. And so I think where I want to begin is just kind of what are the lessons that we've learned in the last year about how election misinformation happens online. And so feel free to kind of jump in. Katie, I might put you on the spot here just to
I'm
start
happy
us
to.
off.
No, I'm happy to. Thank you. Thanks, Naomi, for doing this. I think one big thing that we've realized is that we call it election misinformation, but it's really happening all the time. We need to be thinking about these issues, not just during, the month and the lead up to an election, but it's really an ongoing type of thing that we need to be combating, because we're still having these conversations, and now we're going into the midterms. We just had the Virginia and New Jersey elections, along with many other local ones that happened this week. And so I think that whether it is the tech companies or civil society or election officials and others, we really need to turn these things into an always on program of trying to combat and be ready for.
Yeah, interesting.
I think along those same lines, it's not just U.S. elections. So some of our adversaries are also focused on other democracies around the world, which puts a finer point on Katie's comment that elections are happening all the time. There are democracies having elections year-round. And so I think the platforms are in an interesting position where they're able to actually observe and put into place new policies and procedures to combat misinformation in international elections and bring back some of that learning to help better prepare domestic users for misinformation in our elections.
Something related to that too is, I think at the beginning of the cycle for the last cycle, we were anticipating there being an onslaught of misinformation. We did anticipate that was going to come from foreign sources. And what we learned, is that a lot of the misinformation was homegrown domestically, and that was super problematic.
I mean, just to build off of that a little bit, how effective do you think the systems that tech companies employed to kind of address that homegrown misinformation? Did they do a good enough job last cycle? And what were some of the things that they did do that seemed to work the most?
I think that they did as best they could in the situation that we were in. It was sort of it was like trying to build an airplane while you were flying it. And the tech companies were both responding to the need for accurate information to be promoted, while they were combating or downplaying some of the misinformation or the outright malinformation that was being shared. And we certainly felt like we at the Secretary of State's office had ongoing conversations with representatives from each of those social media platforms that we were utilizing and monitoring. Was it enough? Probably not. Was it better than it was the cycle before? Yes, it was. And so I will take progress over perfection any day.
I think one of the things, so for full disclosure to folks, I was at Facebook the last 10 years and left in March, and working on a lot of these elections efforts and stuff like that. And I think Murphy is right. It was very much a building of the plane as it went on. And I think there was a lot of lessons learned around it in areas that I think the companies still need to be figuring some things out on, particularly when it comes to information that is coming from citizens within the United States, and how you balance that with things like the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. How do you think about allowing people to have the right to speak, but what do you actually amplify? And how is that, what does that again look like in a life cycle? Because it is over a long period of time. I think it's also important to take this as an overall ecosystem. These conversations were not just happening on tech or on the internet, they were also happening on cable news, on talk radio, in other places that would all help to amplify one another and have this information spread. And so I also think that trying to think about how we kind of tackle this across all those different platforms and get people that accurate information is going to be really important, especially since we're going to be we've got redistricting happening. And so people are going to be voting in some states are going to be voting in different districts for Congress. They're going to have different, maybe precincts where they're going to vote, which is perfectly normal. But in the environment we're in right now, there could be a lot more skepticism to that, and people thinking some sort of funny business is happening when it's really just a part of the normal process. And that's one of the things I'm a little worried about as we go into the next year of how do we better help inform citizens and voters about that.
Yeah, what sorts of other potential kind of conspiracies or areas of weakness are people concerned about heading into the next cycle?
I think we saw a pretty good example of that last year with the Sharpie Gate incident, where there was a voter who had a legitimate question about whether or not a Sharpie was used on a ballot, and if that ink bleed through would somehow make it so that their ballot would be thrown out. That's a really good question to ask. It shows that someone's actually checking their ballot, which is what you want to happen. Local officials responded almost immediately to say, nope, no problem. We totally understand your question, and the way that the machines work, don't have to worry about the bleed through. The problem is that that conversation grew and became a very tall tale, and it led to a conspiracy theory where Sharpies being used would somehow end up with ballots that are tossed out. And it grew to a point where that conversation overtook the legitimate and accurate information that the election officials had put out. And so for me, that is the biggest worry that I have, because that's a difficult challenge to try to face at a policy level inside of a tech company, where if you're doing content moderation, you want to basically write rules to be able to fairly evaluate comments like that. And I think that writing the perfect policy, that's not a process that exists. And the speed at which some of these conversations and amplification efforts are happening, even having human review processes may not be fast enough. If there are foreign-backed troll farms whose entire jobs are to amplify misinformation, which have that kernel of truth or legitimacy in terms of being authentic behavior by American voters.
Happening in India, and some questions around authentically engaging volunteers to put things up on Twitter, right? To try to get them to be in the trending topics or other things to try to amplify messages from the campaign. And these questions around what is or is not legitimate organizing on a platform like a Facebook or a Twitter, when it is real people that are doing the actual action, but they're being directed from a campaign or a political party or a group in order to put those things up on the platform. And I think some more of those nuanced situations are definitely going to be ones that the companies and others are going to find themselves in, that can be really hard to address really quickly when they might be newer ways that we hadn't seen before. They are closer to the edge and maybe not fully violating, and trying to figure out, again, that balance. So we should be trying to think about some of those things ahead of time.
Oh, go ahead, Murphy.
I just wanted to, Sharpiegate is, I'm a little triggered right now. That was an Arizona specific incident, but I wanted to share some insight from what happened at the local level that I think might help us combat this misinformation and the disinformation moving forward. From the perspective of the voter, the information that was being promoted was the misinformation, right? And what the information that had been promoted prior to that was coming from the election officials who were attempting to actually pre-bunk any concerns about the use of the Sharpies. Because in Maricopa County, where this happened, prior to this last cycle, Sharpie voters were discouraged from using Sharpies, but the county bought new election equipment, and that's why there was a change in the way that voters were able to vote their ballots, making it okay, in fact, recommended to use Sharpies because the ink dried faster for the tabulators. And so the county did a great job of putting information out ahead of time. That pre-bunking information, if that had been amplified, I think would have been helpful in protecting against the misinformation campaign that followed. And that's a lesson that we learned. And I think it's a lesson that the tech companies and the platforms, social media platforms, can look to in the future is, okay, if there are changes in voting processes or procedures that could become a point of contention or a point of confusion, uplifting the information ahead of time is much more effective than trying to debunk it after the fact.
Yeah. Are there other ideas about, can people be convinced of with accurate information about elections, and what are sort of the strategies that can be used to address conspiracy theories, particularly as many of you have just pointed out, where there's often a kernel of truth embedded in the conspiracy. So can people be convinced of the truth? Is that reversible?
I think some folks can, right? I think anytime we're talking about dealing with and communicating with a large group of people, and there are a lot of voters, thank goodness, that there's always going to be a portion of that population that is open to having a legitimate conversation, a rational conversation about the things that are happening around them. I also think that there are some folks who exist in this day and age where you can self-select all of the information that you want to see and are just engaging in confirmation bias. And those folks are a little more difficult to have those conversations with.
Yeah, I've been reading an interesting study recently called Outside the Bubble. Oxford University just put out the book, and it talks about looking at how social media has increased participation, particularly amongst people who are not as politically active. And I think we talk a lot, and it's important to think about the people who are real political junkies and maybe, are looking for that confirmation bias and stuff. But there's many voters who are just tuning in maybe the last month, of an election, of wanting to, understand what is happening, and might be more susceptible to seeing messages and just assuming that they are true, though nobody should just assume anything on the internet is true. But I think that to Murphy's point, how can we start getting, again, that information out sooner, particularly to people that may not be paying a ton of attention to it, and helping them to understand who are the authoritative sources of information, who are their election officials, what that looks like. I think, there were some efforts done by Facebook, Twitter, and others last cycle around to try to help people better understand what happens in terms of the process of counting your ballot and how those things work, that I would like to, again, see around redistricting, but also that we need to continually remind people of that, because while we all might be seeped in this stuff day in and day out, they aren't. And I think that can be helpful to just set the stage as we go into this.
So there are definitely a couple of more technical options that are available. And one of them is to promote regular post-election audits, not just the close races, not just hand-picked races, but auditing every single contest. It's right now relatively labor-intensive and expensive, but there are techniques like risk-limiting audits where you can audit an entire race by only checking a small portion of the ballots. And I think by starting with that as the ground truth, telling voters that, every contest was checked, there was no foul play, the results are in fact accurate, provides a very good foundation for the next election. Then you build the momentum, and you keep going with this basis of, yes, the last 10 elections, every contest has been audited, there's been no foul play, no interference, so you can trust that the 11th election is going to be run the same way and should likely have same high level of assurance in the outcome. And I think that's how we can move forward in the conversation and accurately convince voters that in fact the processes are good. So let's change that narrative and build in that higher level of voter confidence going into the next election.
Murphy, you're in a state that's had a lot of probes into its election results. Would that work?
I think again that comes down to the audience. In Arizona, we have an elections procedures manual which does require the counties to conduct post-election audits after each election, and that has been the standard here for years. And again, I think that's a situation where it wasn't something that we amplified ahead of time because we couldn't predict the future, and it was old hat here. We conduct multiple audits after every election. We do logic and accuracy tests before and after each election on the tabulation machines. And I think we would run into similar issues when anytime you're trying to pre-bunk or debunk misinformation, which is there will always be an audience that is up for that conversation, and there will always be an audience that is choosing not to participate for whatever reason. And we had we don't call it an audit because it was not an audit. It was a partisan ballot review. There was a partisan ballot review conducted by some folks who had been contracted by the Arizona Senate here, and it didn't increase confidence. And in fact, that whole exercise undermined the legitimacy of the actual audits that were conducted, and created a platform for additional threats of violence against election officials. And so I think we have to be really careful about the timing and about the idea that there's one way to do this, right? I think we have to recognize that people across the country are feeling different ways about elections, and their level of confidence is on a sliding scale, and we need to have multiple conversations that address multiple issues in order to increase that voter confidence. I don't think there's one answer.
If I could jump in there, I think it's important too that how do we again help the public understand there are potentially going to be periods of times where there could be recounts, where the count could take longer than what it would, and that there are like more about that process. But then how do we also make sure we also have a point where we're like, okay, we've done all of the due diligence, and Murphy and them know this. You get to a point where you've done all the due diligence, and then it should be like, we want everybody to accept that. And I don't, I am slightly a bit hopeful of, after seeing the California recall and again the elections earlier this week, Virginia had record turnout in terms of that election. We've had candidates on both the left and the right concede and do all those things that we've traditionally seen as part of an electoral process that we need to instill confidence. And so I think that the thing too is, how do we help to continue to hopefully keep that ball rolling in that direction, and helping people to understand more of this nuance, especially as we go into a midterms where you're not going to have a presidential level race, and you are going to have a lot of, it's a lot of Senate, gubernatorial, congressional, and other races.
That's probably a good segue into the government's role. Oh, Murphy, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Sorry. Turns out I really like talking about this stuff. No, well, what Katie had mentioned about, actually, I lost my train of thought, so we'll just keep it moving.
Okay. Well, I think, what both of you have talked about, hinted at a little bit, is the government's role in all of this. And so I think that's a good segue to discuss that. Before we get into it, I just want to remind our attendees that you can submit questions to us either via our chat on YouTube and Facebook, or using the Twitter hashtag BPCLive. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the government's role in this. Is the U.S. government doing enough to regulate misinformation around elections or other topics online?
How about this? I'll jump in and talk about what I think the government's really good at, which is not necessarily regulating misinformation, but I think CISA is doing a great job in stepping up with products like making sure that there are cybersecurity professionals that are doing outreach in states all across the country to provide the necessary assistance and resources to make sure that local election officials and state election officials know what their options are in terms of cybersecurity. But also doing things like rumor control, having a website that's there available at CISA.gov, so a trusted domain, and is actually addressing issues that are coming up from the state and local officials. So being specific about rumors that are being talked about online, and then putting out facts. And making that available so that they can be read not only by voters, but so that it can be shared by election officials and also shared by members of the media. I think that's a powerful tool in actually directly connecting with everyone that's involved in that cycle of misinformation.
That's a really good point. And you touched on involving the media in that conversation. And I think that what we're seeing right now is really unique in the relationship that election officials and election administrators and voters have with the media. For the first time in all of the years that I've been doing elections communications, there is such a heightened level of interest in the minutia of the processes involved in administrating elections that's coming both from the public and from the press, that it makes election nerds like me really excited because I can talk about those processes more in depth. And I think that is part of the way that we're going to help combat misinformation, as you were saying, Maurice, and just raising the level of confidence. There's a lot that goes into it. I have a little motto. It's like, it turns out democracy is hard and elections are complicated, and that is, that's true. And being able to articulate the depth of effort and expertise required to conduct an election is something that we've struggled to get media attention around, and we don't have to struggle anymore. There's a heightened level of attention, and that's really encouraging.
Okay, but what about Congress, the administration? Like, are there? I'm hearing a lot of praise, but are there areas in which some of those regulators or lawmakers could step in to kind of force tech companies' hands in this, or the media's hands?
I feel like there are some lawmakers, some elected officials who could step up by just not spreading misinformation. Like they should probably keep their own house clean. So I'll start with that.
Two things. One, that this is where it's interesting, since the Facebook papers came out, and you've been seeing some of the conversation and some of the recommendations from people like Francis and others around maybe looking less at the content itself and more what are product design changes that you can do to try to deter people from even spreading misinformation in the first place, or even putting it up on the platform. That could be more friction, for instance, like you actually have to click on a link before you share it, or other things that could be looked at. And then I think too, I think also the government potentially, things like Nate Priscilli from Stanford has a proposed piece of legislation around making it easier for researchers to get data in a privacy safe way so that people can study how misinformation actually spreads on these platforms around elections, so we can even better understand the problem and what might be able to be done around it. And then I would say we would be remiss to also not mention the states. The states, given the decentralized structure of US elections, and obviously, a handful of states have made some changes to the actual election administering process, but I think they also could play a role in terms of helping not only the tech companies think about this, but election officials around what should be done to get people authoritative information out. And I'd be remiss, and I hope Murphy will be happy with me saying this, but like, with these things must come more funding and support for election officials. One of the biggest issues that I had with some of the voting bills that were up in Congress is the substance was great, but it provided no additional funding for election officials to actually carry that out. And these are very small operations, and many times they're being asked to wear multiple hats. They're now under a lot of harassment that many times is not even addressed, whether it's by law enforcement or the tech companies around that. And so we really need to make sure we're providing the infrastructure and support to the actual election administrators as part of all of this.
Okay, we have some audience questions I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to respond to. So one comes from Stephen, and he asks, would it be helpful to be able to provide more evidence about who voted, who won before the election results were certified, instead of after those results or when those audits take place? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So in Arizona, all those, the post-election audits do occur in Arizona before certification. So maybe the idea here is for us to amplify those processes earlier on, now that we know that there's an appetite for learning more about them.
There are some states that, just for the sake of the legislative decisions that were made in the past, their audits actually happen and they can finish after certification of results, which seems to be a pretty big miss if it turns out that there were mistakes that were made, or there was something that needed to change after the fact. So I think there is some cleanup there, but also there are states that, looking at the other end of the process, they actually allow their election officials to start pre-processing mail-in ballots. Which greatly helps out with identifying any ballots that have had any issues. Maybe people forgot a signature, or there were overvotes or undervotes. It really helps election officials spread out the work rather than trying to count every single ballot exactly on election day and then hold them to that same standard of, well, we want the results before midnight. That's unfair to election officials and all the poll workers who are there, having a late night and feeling the additional pressure and stress of having all eyes on them, in addition to the threats of violence.
Sure. We have another question from Shannon, and Katie, I think I want to put this to you because you were at Facebook, but Facebook requires you to be a real person to post ads, including political ads, on the platform. Talk to us about, but not every social media platform, has the same rules that Facebook does. A, could you kind of give us an overview about how effective that was, and B, if it's something that other companies might want to think about? And Maurice and Murphy, feel free to jump in if after.
Yeah, the political and issue ad transparency work is something I'm quite proud of. It has a lot of improvements that could be had, but it really we did see it really be a deterrent in terms of bad actors or unknown actors getting advertisements into this space around elections in the United States. I think that one of the things, though, is that a lot of these issues were on the organic side and the non-paid side. And while Facebook did have some rules in there around pages of a certain size, the admins needing to provide an ID and things of that nature, I think more work to be done to help people have more context and transparency when they're seeing organic content in their feed or their recommendations. Stuff like that is always going to be more helpful. It would be great to potentially see other platforms do that. We don't necessarily need to get into the pros and cons of whether or not to allow people to be anonymous on the internet or not. That's particularly, that can, it can be a real concern because of harassment and violence that can happen to people when their names are attached to things. And that's particularly a concern outside of the United States. But, I think, it's another one of those things of trying to weigh on the safety and harm in some of these projects. But I think overall, the lesson here is just more transparency. And some of these things, these friction type things of asking people to provide an ID can help to deter some of the bad activity.
Are there other things that would be on your wish list for tech companies to do to address kind of election misinformation?
Yeah, I'll go and then I'm sorry, I should have just jumped in, but I think more around, like I know at Facebook, we had a tool we tried to for election administrators of being able to boost content to voters in their area, and how can we think about that on other platforms? I think too, again, we don't want to necessarily put this all on election administrators because again, they've got a lot of things that they're trying to do in the lead up to an election. So trying to throw social media on there as yet another thing that they have to do is quite a bit. So how can the broader, there's a very wide civic, civil society community that is focused on these issues, and how can they help to be getting some of this information out there as well, I think. And so I'd like to see even more cooperation on that front. But I'm curious what Maurice and Murphy think.
I agree.
Yeah, social media platforms are complicated. We are so far down the path of that being an unregulated industry that it's really up to the technology companies to make these kinds of policy decisions. And there's a tendency, by the public and also by policymakers to group them all together, even though there are very different scales and at different places along their paths of maturity. Facebook's almost 20 years old, but if you look at a platform like TikTok, it's almost as large as Facebook, but it hasn't only been around for a couple of years. And so to group everyone together and set the same expectations, even though their staffing and their business models may be different, it's not particularly fair. Have this all happen at once, and the way that not only authentic behavior is showing up on platforms, but the inauthentic behavior is changing rapidly. And so I think that there is an underappreciation for the pace at which this threat is evolving to go along with it.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the consequences of all of this. What's the impact of the rise of potentially of conspiracy theories on the 2022 midterm elections? Give us the nightmare scenario.
I don't think we have to be all that imaginative to get to the nightmare scenario. We've come close to the edge, right? I live in Washington, D.C. I was in my home, less than a mile away from the Capitol on January 6th. That was nightmare enough for me. And to know that a great deal of that organizing happened on social media platforms is concerning. But I'm also not confident that lawmakers have the policy answer to counter that. I do think that there is a cautionary tale to say, be careful what you ask for. It wasn't but just a few weeks ago that in Russia, during its election, the ruling party decided to crack down on opposition candidates and coalition building that was going on via an app, and it actually forced Apple to pull that app from the App Store. I don't think voters in the United States want that to happen. But that's an example of what can happen, fairly easily if there is enough of a push to get government involved and do something. And so that's what I'm concerned with. Not only the outcome of some of the organizing, but if there is enough fear out there and enough confidence that's been eroded in the public around elections, that there is a strong call for the government to do something, that may be more damaging.
Are there potential threats to 2022?
I mean, again, I'm very nervous about mass confusion again around redistricting, the lateness of redistricting, and trying to get that information out there. I think too there'll still be a lot of pressure. We haven't, after the deplatforming of President Trump, it's sort of been tucked away a little bit. But I think that as you get more candidates that are running, and particularly, like, we should remember, like, the general elections in November, primaries start. I think there's a smattering in March, but mostly May. I think right now is when, so we're even closer to some of these election contests happening. In some areas, the primaries may actually be a place that could be more problematic potentially than the general, given who might be, especially if you have some more far right candidates that are running and continue to push the 2020 election fraud story. And I think social media companies will become under more pressure to potentially deplatform more candidates in the lead up to an election, which will raise a whole bunch of additional issues around fairness and other things like that. And so, I do worry a bit about just a lot of mass confusion and competing interests with that. But like I said, I do hold out some hope given how California, Virginia, and Jersey and others have gone recently.
That's a good point. This kind of develops differently among the different parties, right? And we should talk about that in a little bit. But just as a reminder, you can send us a question on YouTube or Facebook in the chat, or tweet using the hashtag BPCLive. So let's talk about the partisan breakdown around election misinformation. It operates differently among Democrats and Republicans. We've seen some Republicans who are actually concerned that the conspiracy theories could depress turnout. I'm curious about kind of truth scrubbing that claim. What do people think is the impact of some of this election misinformation on Republicans and perhaps the potential benefit as well?
I mean, there was certainly a concern, right? Seeing it in Georgia, and there's been a concern by Republicans that will this suppress turnout on the right? Again, we didn't see that in Virginia. I forgot to look at what Jersey's turnout was with that. So maybe that's unfounded, maybe it's not. I think we have to be careful about looking to Jersey as an indicator of like the entire country, like some people might want to with that. And so, but I do think that that is a potential concern of what will it do to turnout. I think too that this is where the primary fights are going to be really interesting on the right, and is something I'm very much looking at in terms of who does get picked in these primaries, and are they people that continue to push the election fraud narrative or not, and do they actually try to turn the page away from all of that. Unclear if that's going to happen or not, but I think that is going to, you're seeing a lot of Republicans like Adam Kinzinger choosing not to run anymore because of some of those threats that they might be facing. And that concerns me. I also would be remiss if I also didn't mention that there's going to be quite a few secretaries of state that are up for re-election in 2022. And so they too are going to be going through an election while trying to administer an election. And I think that's going to be something to very much keep an eye on, of who is running for those offices as we look at what this stuff's going to look like in 2024.
Yeah. And then there's the flip side, right? Like that all the election misinformation about the results of last year's election have prompted laws addressing fictional fraud. And Murphy, I kind of want to put this to you. What's the impact of that? Is there a danger for Democrats here?
I think that there's an overall danger, and in that these efforts combined will, and we're already seeing it, right? They are eroding confidence in fair and free elections in our country, and that's the nightmare scenario for me, right? Is that we hit a point where our voters no longer trust the system at all. And so it's not just a matter of them not participating, it's a matter of the processes in the system itself collapsing. And that's what keeps me up at night, right? Like are the steps that are being taken now enough to protect the processes and the systems in place to administer free and fair elections? And I think so far they have been, and I think we've gotten real close to knocking the legs out from under it, as Maurice was saying. And that's a really tough position for us all to be in. It's scary.
Yeah, I think that voters are hypersensitive to issues. The media is ready to, uncover issues, and critics are ready to pounce on even just basic operational mistakes that can happen. New Jersey was a good example of that. They introduced new electronic poll books, which on the whole are a great way to speed up voters getting through the line, to do verification, to reduce the amount of potential fraud so that people are less successful if they try to double vote. But they require internet connectivity. And so one of the issues that came out was, quite frankly, routers at certain polling places weren't plugged in. So you're asking poll workers, who are typically going to be older, not particularly, technically inclined, to be on top of new technology to make sure it's working. And when there's a basic mistake like a router not being plugged in, it slows down the line, and then the misinformation can start to grow on that kernel of truth, and people start asking questions about whether or not they're going to be able to vote at that time. There might be some procedures about whether to have voters use provisional ballots instead, which is more time consuming on the counting side. And in fact, it wasn't anything, 2 hours later, because those issues were resolved. But still, everyone involved was sensitive to that kind of a delay. And it goes to show what could happen if a determined malicious actor actually wanted to take out communications and have a negative impact and interfere in the elections process. So something that's purposeful is something that we haven't seen yet. Typically, it's been these incidental or one-off kind of operational delays. And so I'm concerned about what could happen if there is a sustained and persistent attack that's actually designed to interfere with our elections, rather than just basic operational mistakes that are going to be, at specific precincts and relatively innocuous.
Great. I think a couple of our audience members have asked some form of this question, which is, what can really be done about the politicians and the parties themselves that are actually spreading the misinformation? The ones in theory who would have access to high quality information, but are instead choosing to spread misinformation.
So there's a reason. There's part of the reason I think that they are spreading it is that they do get attention from it. They are able to raise money, and so I think one of the things I've been even thinking about is small dollar fundraising. Is there regulation that should go into place that maybe elected officials and candidates can only raise money from people in the district or the state of which they're running? I don't know if that's the right answer, but and then also too, like how, and again, this is not to throw it on you, Naomi, with the media, you don't have to answer it, but just the balance of giving attention to these things that are happening, and how do you cover them without also adding, fanning the flames of what is happening around that. And so I think there's some conversations and things that could be happening on that way of understanding the incentives of why they are doing it, and can some of those be closed off so that they're less inclined to do so.
Other thoughts? I take that feedback, Katie. Other thoughts about what can we do to address the politicians and the parties that are doing the ones spreading the misinfo?
Yeah, you can vote, right? Like
Yeah.
right? Like you as voters, we have the power to hold folks accountable. And if there are folks who are being unethical about the way that they are sharing information or promulgating misinformation, then yeah, I think ultimately the power rests with the voters, and that's the ultimate authority.
Yeah. Great. Well, this has been a really great conversation, and certainly as a journalist, I think I've taken a lot away about, with some potential threads to explore as we continue kind of covering tech companies' response to this and government's response to this problem. I want to thank you all for participating, and to everyone watching, I would encourage you all to go find these experts on Twitter and follow them, because I'm sure there was way more to say than we had the opportunity to share in this session. But thank you for attending.